Hi, and welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel, a series on reimagining the world from the mundane. My name is George Palmeyu, and in this episode, we will talk about humanitarianism, how the desire and incitement to rescue and save others has become key to how we are what we are in the contemporary world. Our guest is Inderpal Grewal, whose book, Saving the Security State, explores new ways to imagine the relationship between humanitarianism, governance, and militarization today. So stay tuned for a conversation on how a particular perspective on humanitarianism may help us better understand the current global order. Inderpal Grewal is Professor Emerita of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies, American Studies and Anthropology at Yale University. She's one of the founders of the field known today as Transnational Feminist Studies. She has done extensive research on questions focused on post-colonialism, mobility and modernity, non-governmental organizations and human rights, or law and citizenship, among many other subjects. Professor Grewal is author of numerous publications, of which I will mention some books: Home and Harem, Nation, Gender, Empire, and the Culture of Travel, published in 1996, and Transnational America, Feminism, Diasporas, and Neoliberalism, published in 2005. Our conversation today will focus on her book, Saving the Security State, Exceptional Citizens in 21st Century America, published in 2017. Inderpal, we are delighted you have accepted our invite, and it's a great joy to have you on Ethnographic Imagination Basel.
I'm delighted to be here.
So let me open the conversation, and I'm thinking here how to cover the basics. Maybe to start with the basic question of what is humanitarianism? How would you describe it for a larger audience interested to learn what we mean by it and why we should care about it and why we should care about it now?
I think we should care about it right now because of what's going on in the world. There's a lot of calls for, in the war in Gaza that's happening right now, there are calls for creating a humanitarian corridor for the refugees, for the Palestinians. What does it mean to be humanitarian right now in the aftermath of killings and tragedy? And so the question of humanitarianism is always alive somewhere. It came about very much through the ways in which human rights was articulated in the mid-century after the Second World War, and the eruption of human rights law and human rights, ideas of human rights, and the way in which we needed to care about a generalized notion of humanity, right? So it's part of liberal thought very much about human rights law, and it has taken many different shapes. For instance, people use terms such as humanitarian war, and that began with the U.S. interventions in the Balkans. That at that time, President Clinton used these terms to talk about why America had to be in the Balkans and to rescue people in Kosovo, etc. And so it's been around very much to describe both war, the ways in which we have to save people from war, the lives of how to think about refugees, how to think about migrants, and also in some ways to think about sort of solidarities with other people because of a notion of a shared humanity. And all these ideas are 20th century ideas. The popularity of the term has become widespread. There are humanitarian organizations, there are think tanks devoted to it. There's, of course, a large international legal structure that's part of this. So there is a way in which humanitarianism has become widespread in popular culture. It's also an interesting term because, of course, though humanitarianism seems to be about certain groups of people trying to rescue other people because of a shared humanity, it actually, interestingly, draws attention to the person doing the saving, right? The humanitarian is the person who we pay attention to. And there's a lot of publicity in popular culture around these humanitarians. So they're given awards, there are celebrations of their actions. And so we pay a lot of attention to the people who are humanitarians. Some figures in popular culture redeem their reputations by becoming humanitarians. Right. Some corporations redeem their reputations by turning to humanitarian causes. So it's become a very widespread way to think about it. The historian Sam Moyn, for instance, has looked at the history of humanitarianism and human rights internationalism. And he argues that actually humanitarianism, rather than being a way to address the problems of war, for instance, might even lead to more such violence. Right? So he thinks that the existence of something called humanitarianism sort of propels and provides an alibi for violence in some way or another, right? And that's part of the kind of broad way in which humanitarianism has become part of everyday life and popular culture, especially in what we call the West. So in my book, I talk about the way in which humanitarianism is part of a kind of logic of security and violence, that it is the other side of it. It provides an alibi for violence also, following Moyn. And I think about humanitarianism as creating exemplary citizens, that these people see themselves as exemplary in their desire to help others. But I argue that what they actually do is they prop up a security state that has come about since the end of the 20th century in America and other places, that they provide an alibi for this kind of violence of security and securitization.
So there is, on the one hand, it seems a certain way in which it has embedded itself, this logic of humanitarianism, this desire and incitement to rescue, to save, has embedded itself in the mundane. On the other hand, it does get coupled with the exceptional, with war, probably producing the logic of exceptionalism. But if we were to just dwell a little bit on its mundaneness, you argue in the book that humanitarianism is something that is, in a way, no longer reducible to the institutions that we commonsensically associate with it. It's not just about NGOs. It's not just about humanitarian institutions per se, but that it has come to shape the common sense of what it means, as you just said, to be a citizen, to be a good citizen, or as you call them, exceptional citizens. So what are exceptional citizens today, and how did humanitarian logics become so important in shaping the meanings of citizenship?
That's a great question. So in this book, I really wanted to engage with the way in which the US has a kind of specific history of humanitarianism. So I wanted to think about a longer duration of the ways in which this idea of being humanitarianism is part of exceptionalism in neoliberal America, as I think about it, right? And then, so what I argue in the book is that after decades of neoliberal policies that began with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and the idea that actually government, as Reagan said famously, was a problem rather than a solution, what has happened is that the state has shed more of its work of welfare on ordinary people as well. So after a big catastrophe, for instance, you will find people who call themselves humanitarianism rushing to the rescue of people. Famously, someone like the film star Brad Pitt went after the catastrophe in Katrina, the hurricane, when the city of New Orleans was destroyed, to go and rescue people, to create houses. And he became famous for doing that. He sort of resurrected his reputation, and sort of people began to see him as someone who should be celebrated in a wholly different way. And so what I find really interesting is the work of anthropologists in doing this work. So journalists can come and talk to Brad Pitt and record what he says and celebrate him and do an interview with him. We need researchers who go and follow what happened, what his work did over long periods of time, who can follow, who can be in New Orleans, who can see what people say about the work, who can go there year after year and follow that. And it's only then that you find out what happens to that work. Right? It's a longer duration of looking at an NGO. It's looking at popular culture. It's looking at how people on the ground think about him, how the houses that he built, how did they end? How did people live in them? What did they think about them? So all of these ways about the lived experience of the so-called objects of humanitarian care are really important for us to investigate as researchers, as anthropologists.
Absolutely. And you mentioned now stars who actually go and perform that kind of subject position of the humanitarian. But if we were to take an ethnographic note here, in your book, you also talk about certain kind of, I don't know, shall we call them social types or subject positions that emerge in this historical moment, right. One of which is the security mom.
Yes.
Would you like to say more about that?
Well, as a feminist, I was very interested in thinking about how women are pushed into these positions, right? And under neoliberal circumstances, they have to see themselves in some ways as becoming part of doing something to help others, right? Active citizens of a state that sees itself as exceptional in the world, right? So my notion of exceptional citizens comes from the way in which in the US, there's a particular version of its imperial stance in the world that it sees itself as an exceptional place, right? And because of its neoliberalism, that exceptionalism can no longer be upheld. It's a waning power, one can say. This empire is slowly declining. And so in that way, when it is declining, individuals rush in to prop it up. So I see some ways in which some women and some who call themselves feminist feel, as we will say, as this term always is used, empowered to become as some kind of agents of the state. I look at security mom in terms of popular culture. You see this figure very much in movies, for instance. There is a famous movie I talk about in the book, which is called Zero Dark 30, and it's about the killing of Osama bin Laden. And it sort of circuits around a woman who is a key figure in the CIA, who's a secret agent who's trying to find information about bin Laden, and how she comes to be a part of his targeted killing. And what I find so interesting is, as much as the film, for instance, celebrates her as a heroine, it in the end shows that she's actually not an agent in the killing, that it is the masculinity of a SEAL team, like a very heteronormatively characterized SEAL team of these very stock characters, heroic characters in American culture that have to come in and do the work. And she is outside that frame of the target, of the targeted killing. And in the end, she has lost her friends. She's in despair. She comes back on the plane alone and crying. So all of these ways in which the security feminist, for instance, in this case, is both empowered to help the state, but actually loses out because of the masculinity of the state itself, right? I look at security mom as another way in which mothers are compelled and exhorted, indeed, to surveil their families. What does it mean to be a good mother? Is to know where your child is at every given point. And here, the work of technology is really important because technology is sold to us on the basis of fear and paranoia and the ways in which we have to protect the home, the family against all these different others. And the others in our times are, of course, not just the quote unquote, the terrorist, but also the migrant, for instance. It's a key figure in the imagination of the security state, right? This kind of others. But the security state is also there to repress and shape citizens that can do its work, right? And so I argue in the book that relations within families, parental relations, take shape as relations of surveillance. And that in order to protect the family, you have to have gadgets on your phone that tell you exactly where your child is at any given point. That you need to make sure that they have a gadget that they can be controlled, not just controlled, but they can be connected to you at every given point, right? And that these technologies are sold with a great deal of paranoia and fear of insecurity. So actually, what I do argue in the book is that the work of security, the work of the security state, is to create insecurity at every given point, right? And that insecurity is a part of consumer culture as well.
Absolutely. On a comparative note, I would wonder also to what extent what you described, the forms of surveillance that emerge with this kind of subject of rescue or subject who exercises rescue also revolves so centrally around intimacy in a way.
Yes.
And the intimate space, not the relation with the children, because your description of the security mom, but also the humanitarian subject resonates very strongly with work I've been doing in Kenya, where neighbors can report each other to the police if a mother abandons the child in the house and goes working and doesn't feed it. And there the idea is, the way it's expressed is, we are doing the work of rescue. And it's precisely that signifier, rescue, that's being used. So one wonders then, what you describe here for America and American imperialism, having become a global sort of phenomenon that shapes citizenship in many places.
Yeah. No doubt. I think you're very much on point to talk about the way in which American culture, American ideas circulate very powerfully around the world, right? And of course, in Kenya, they take shape in different ways. Who gets reported on, who does the reporting, how the government asks people to report, all of these can be quite different. This in the US begins after 9/11, when you have the emergence of all these signs everywhere in airports and in train stations. If you see something, say something, right? That is the way in which the idea of reporting, of surveillance, everyday surveillance that everybody can participate in, comes about. Right. And so if you see something, say something, becomes so pervasive and so much a part of everyday life. It's often a joke in some ways. Comedians make fun of it, but it is everywhere. It is part of the zeitgeist in some ways, that you have to say something if you see something odd. So on airplanes, for instance, there are so many people who report their fellow passengers, for instance, for speaking a language they don't understand.
Right.
And they'll go to the pilot and they say, I'm afraid of this person sitting next to me, right? And so there are so many of these cases that come about as surveillance increases. So before we know it, this happens. But there's also technologies. In our phones, you can have phones that track your friends. You can see who's nearby. You can follow somebody and you can track your partner. You are always connected to them. You always know where they are. So some of these ways in which sort of this surveillance has become very much a part of everyday life. Another form of surveillance that we've seen a lot is attention to what's called trafficking of women. There are signs everywhere in many parts of the US especially in airports, in the bathrooms, in the women's bathrooms of the airports, I have noticed in the stalls, you will see signs that say, "Are you a victim of trafficking?" Right? You report it. Or do you see a victim of trafficking? You can report somebody. And what has become important is that, again, the merging of the notion of surveillance and rescue has come about in precisely these moments, right? If you see someone trafficked, report it, right? You're doing the rescue of this trafficked person, but you're also doing surveillance on a fellow passenger, another person who's traveling with you, right?
And you're doing the work of self-making by producing yourself as a good citizen who collaborates and reports. Can we focus a bit on the relationship between humanitarianism and feminism, which you brought up, and it's a really important and recurrent issue? Would I be right to point out a paradox here? That on the one hand, so much of humanitarian work is done in the name of feminism. You mentioned the security mom, you write also about the security feminist, but I'm also thinking here more broadly about transnational feminist humanitarianism, from girl empowerment initiatives to anti-FGM campaigns, empowerment of women through microfinance, what have you. On the other hand, through transnational feminist studies, we have a way to critically interrogate both the effects and the conditions of possibility of that transnational feminist humanitarianism. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about that and how you see the relationship more broadly between feminism and humanitarianism.
Yeah. Now, for that, it's a great question. But for that, we have to go back to a longer history of colonialism, of European colonialism, in which, as historians have also shown, the idea of women's rights, for instance, in the West, is often comes about through a rhetoric of freedom that is contrasted with the unfreedom of women in the global South, for instance. Right. So there's a logic of saying, well, we need our rights in the West because we are unlike those other people, those other women who don't have the rights. So there's this longer history, and Gayatri Spivak, for instance, the theorist, has written about this, the kind of rescue of brown women, of the by white men, right? And it's a trope that you see repeated over and over again in humanitarian NGOs, for instance. There's such a plethora of international NGOs that focus on precisely this kind of work, whether it is what's called rescuing women from gender-based violence, GBV in the war, whether it is NGOs that are devoted to rescuing women from trafficking, whether it is to provide water, whether it is to give them a vote, whatever it is. There are so many NGOs that are devoted to this. And there are very many debates about this. So many feminists see these NGOs and see these practices as continued forms of imperialism, for instance, right? Whereas others, the anthropologist Sally Mary, famously, who sadly passed away, did important work in looking actually at people on the ground and seeing how they took these kinds of logics of empowerment and rescue and turned it to their own needs and responded and used it very creatively to for their own agendas. So that's the other way in which we can think about this, is that though international feminist organizations sort of impose and bring different ideas of how to rescue women and what women around the world need, what we find, interestingly, through work on the ground, through looking at what women are doing on the ground, is that they can be very creative in using this. I also want to talk about one other way to think about this kind of broad transnational feminist agenda. And that is that in these NGOs, and I edited a book called Theorizing NGOs in which we talk about this, that what is interesting is is that even though so many of these NGOs may not think of themselves as doing a kind of imperial rescue mission of being white saviors, for instance, what they do is shape the ways in which the subject women or girls are being constructed, right? So they participate very much in constructing these subjects in new ways for our time. So that is some of the work that we can think about, that it's not just rescuing women, but it's actually shaping the subject in very different ways. When you talk about, for instance, the women, sort of gender-based violence has a particular kind of subject in mind, right? Or the girl child, for instance, emerged as a particular kind of target of rescue in new ways. So we have all these different subjects that are being constructed by these NGOs. And the tension is, of course, that there are ways in which so many of us find that these constitute what Anna Singh calls frictions in the global encounters of feminism. So it's interesting to look at feminist NGOs and other kinds of feminisms that push against these, right, as well. There's a new anthology that's just come out that I have an essay in. It's called The Cunning of Gender Violence, which is edited by anthropologist Laila Abu-Lughod and Rima Hamami and Nadra Shalhoub. And they look at the way in which gender-based violence has become a way to shape and control the lives of women in distant places as well. And so they focus on Muslim women, for instance. In that book, I look at the condition of Muslim women in India at this moment in time as a very right-wing government based that is focused on Hindu nationalism, sees all Muslims as aliens, and what happens to women at that time and what happens to Muslim women under those circumstances. So there's a way to think about feminism as caught up in all these tensions of what we call transnationalism, right? Absolutely. In all these debates.
Yeah. You brought up already the power or potential of thinking about the relationship between feminism and humanitarianism and beyond with a certain kind of ethnographic imagination, by speaking precisely of the kind of various contexts in which people turn these logics around, logics that come down from the state and institutions being turned against those states and those institutions, being deployed creatively, the forms of friction that may emerge. And I wanted us to dwell a little bit, maybe in concluding this episode, on what might constitute the potential of ethnography, because one encounters ethnography also deployed in humanitarian organizations for purposes of surveillance. So where do you see, especially with the rise of the security state in late capitalism, where do you see the potential of exercising a certain kind of ethnographic imagination to both displace but also be careful at the kind of effects of some of these logics?
That's a really good question to end with, because famously, anthropology also got caught up in a lot of state enterprises. After 9/11, anthropologists were being recruited to understand these different Muslim cultures, for instance, to be part of the State Department and to be recruited into doing the work for the US government. And there was a very big debate at that time about whether anthropologists should be part of this or not. But the ethnographic imagination, for instance, is something that we can use to think about how imperialism affects people in all kinds of different spaces. The anthropologist Madiha Tahir, for instance, has looked at the ways in which the drone warfare waged by the U.S. affects people in northern Pakistan, for instance, right? Right after 9/11, the U.S. was waging drone warfare in many, many regions for decades, right? And she looked at the ways in which on the ground communities understood what was happening to them, what they felt about it, how they dealt with the violence that happened in their lives. So that's very important work that we can do to look at the ways in which the victims of empire, right, also have a voice, that their experiences can be heard, that their experiences can be recorded and described as well. So that's part of it. What's another sort of vignette that I will give you about the ethnographic imagination is, in my book, I talk about this figure, Greg Mortensen, who wrote this book called 3 Cups of Tea, in which he talked about his NGO building schools for girls in northern Pakistan. And he kind of creates himself as a mountaineer who happened onto this need that he saw in the oppressed women who were not getting any education. So he built these schools. It was only anthropologists who sort of investigated actually what was happening there on the ground and found that many of the schools were not built, right, that they fell apart after a little while. So it's sort of ethnographies sort of question some of these ways in which celebrations of humanitarians, for instance, have to be investigated with some care for people. And it is anthropology that really seems to emerge as being able to do a work of maybe forensics after a war, in post-conflict zones, looking at what weapons and war create. It can also research up elites who are creating these drones, for instance, the work that Paul Rabenow did in laboratories, scientific labs, for instance, but also research it down. So both elite spaces and non-elite spaces can be looked at. And that's a potential that's very exciting, to think of these together, to think of an ethnographic imagination as looking at the lived experience of people who are extremely powerful and looking at the lived experience of people who are the recipients of that power, for instance. And that's a very important task I think we have today facing us, because it's a world of even greater inequality than ever before. Right.
And in doing so, hopefully displacing a little bit the central ways in which humanitarianism has embedded itself in our common sense today. For our audience, if you're interested to learn more about the topics discussed in this episode, please check out Inderpal Grewal's book, Saving the Security State, and her other writings. Inderpal, I want to thank you very much for your time and for the insightful conversation. And we look forward to continuing reading your work and being inspired by it.
Thank you, George. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you for the conversation. It's been really terrific.